Chapter 16 The Chaos in the City. As soon as Alfred was appointed the crown prince, he began familiarizing himself with the duties that he would have to undertake before he became the kingdom's ruler. He knew that there was a lot to learn before taking the throne. He started by reading all the books and documents he could get his hands on about the history of his nation. He spent hours with the advisors, discussing policies and understanding the nuances of governance. Alfred knew that he couldn't do it all alone. He needed people he could trust to help him govern his nation. So, he started looking at the information about various nobles in the kingdom. He wanted to identify those who shared his vision for the nation and bring them into his inner circle. He spent hours studying their backgrounds and talking to his advisors seeking their advice. He knew that some of the nobles would be reluctant to join him, so he decided to meet them in person. He traveled to different parts of his nation, meeting with nobles and talking to them about his vision for the future. He wanted to assure them that he was committed to the betterment of the nation. Alfred also knew that he had to be patient. He couldn't rush things, and he had to let things take their natural course. Alfred's dedication to his duty and his commitment to his nation did not go unnoticed. The people began to see him as a responsible leader who was committed to their well-being. The nobles too started to take notice of him, and many of them began to support him. Prince Edward had always harbored ambitious aspirations. Moreover, his longing for power and influence intensified after his father's health began to decline and his younger brother, Felix, who was supposed to be in line for the throne, passed away. Despite being the eldest son, Edward was convinced by Felix's appointment as the crown prince, as he was a truly talented and charismatic individual. However, with Felix's untimely death, Edward was left feeling unsatisfied, especially as the unknown younger brother, Alfred, was named the new crown prince instead of him. One day, Prince Edward received a message from a group of cultists who worshipped an unorthodox god known as the God of Shadows. They offered to help him secure the throne if he would agree to certain conditions. At first, Edward was hesitant, but his ambition got the better of him, and he agreed to meet with the cultists. Prince Edward walked through the dimly lit alleyways, his mind racing with thoughts of power and dominance. He had always been envious of his younger brother, Alfred, and the attention he received from their father. It was time for Edward to make his move and take what he believed was rightfully his. The meeting took place in a secluded part of the city. As he walked, a shadowy figure appeared from the darkness. Edward recognized him immediately as the leader of the cult that worshipped the God of Shadow. They had been rumored to possess dark powers that could aid them in battle and assassination. The cult leader bowed to Edward and began speaking in hushed tones. "Your Highness, we have been waiting for you. Our Lord, the God of Shadow, has shown us a vision to support you on the throne. We are willing to help you achieve your destiny." Edward listened intently, his eyes widening as the cult leader outlined his plan. In return for their help, Edward promised to give the cultists his support for their religious practices and the establishment of their temple in the imperial capital. He knew that the cultists can have a considerable influence in the kingdom, and their support could help him solidify his position as the crown prince. He agreed to their conditions, and the deal was struck. Little did he know that his actions would have dire consequences for the people of the kingdom and his own family. Days went by, and the people of the imperial city began to notice a sudden increase in criminal activities, from petty theft to violent attacks. The streets were no longer safe, and the citizens lived in constant fear. The imperial guard tried to keep order, but they were overwhelmed by the surge in crime. Alfred, the crown prince, took notice of the situation and decided to investigate the matter. He summoned the head of the imperial guard, General Fernando, to his chambers in the imperial palace. "General Fernando, I have received reports of a surge in criminal activities in the city." "What is the situation like?" Alfred asked, with a tone of concern. "It's bad, Your Highness. The number of incidents has increased tenfold in the last few weeks. We are doing our best to keep the streets safe, but we are stretched thin," General Fernando replied, looking weary. "Do you have any leads on the source of the problem?" Alfred asked. "We have been investigating, but we haven't found any concrete evidence yet. It's as if the criminals have become bolder and more organized," General Fernando said. "I see. Keep me updated on the situation. I want to know as soon as you have any leads," Alfred said, dismissing the general. Alfred knew that something was amiss, and he suspected that Prince Edward might be involved. He had always been wary of his elder brother and knew that he would stop at nothing to gain what he wanted. Meanwhile, the crime rate continued to rise, and the citizens grew increasingly restless. They demanded action from the imperial palace, and some even began to blame Alfred for not doing enough to keep the city safe. His situation was getting out of hand, and Alfred knew that he had to act fast before it spiraled out of control. The once peaceful streets of the imperial city were now filled with the loud voices of angry citizens. They were shouting, demanding that something be done about the recent state of unrest that had taken hold of the city. Prince Edward stood on his balcony, overlooking the chaos below. He couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction at the sight. With the help of the cultists, he succeeded in making the people believe that Alfred was to blame for all the problems that plagued the city. The prince smiled to himself, thinking about how easy it had been to manipulate the people. He knew that his brother was a capable ruler, but he had always been envious of his position. Edward had always believed that he was the rightful heir to the throne, and he was willing to do anything to make that a reality. Alfred knew that he had to do something to quell the unrest. He held meetings with his advisors, trying to come up with a solution. But no matter what he did, it seemed that things were still getting worse. Edward, looking at this scene, smiled to himself, thinking about the power that would soon be his. He had always been ambitious, but now, more than ever, he was determined to do whatever it took to become the kingdom's ruler. Maximus sat at his desk, reading a report detailing the recent chaos that had taken over the imperial capital. He frowned deeply as he read about the abnormal increase in crime rates and the unrest that had taken hold of the city. Summoning Phantom, he instructed him to investigate the situation. Days passed as the Phantom group worked tirelessly to uncover the truth. And finally, their report arrived on Maximus' desk. His eyes scanned the words quickly as he read the details of Prince Edward's collusion with the cultists. Rage filled him as he remembered the pain and loss he had suffered at the hands of cultists. He knew that he could not allow them to go unpunished. But he also knew that he could not intervene directly. He was not yet strong enough to take on the cultists alone. Instead, he composed a unanimous letter to the current ruler, Magnus, detailing the situation. He knew that it was the best course of action. As he sealed the letter and handed it off to his messenger, he knew that there was more that he could do, but he was too lazy to bother. All he could do was wait and hope that the king would take swift and decisive action. Chapter 17, Detaining the Eldest Prince. Magnus sat in his private chambers, surrounded by stacks of documents and scrolls that needed his attention. He had been working tirelessly for hours, sifting through the bureaucratic mess of his kingdom, trying to ensure that everything was in order. Suddenly, the door to the chamber opened, and a eunuch entered the room, his face pale and trembling. He carried a letter in his hand, which he presented to the king with a deep bow. Magnus raised an eyebrow and asked, "Who sent this letter?" He took the letter and broke the seal. "I do not know, Your Majesty," the eunuch replied, his voice shaking with fear. "It appeared suddenly on your desk, as if by magic." Magnus frowned, then began to read the letter. As he read, his expression changed from one of confusion to one of shock and anger. He clenched his fists, his knuckles turning white as he read about his son, Prince Edward, involvement with the recent chaos. As he continues to read, Magnus suddenly stood up, his face twisted in fury. How could he do this? He muttered to himself, pacing back and forth across the room. How could he be involved with the cultist? How could he be so foolish? The eunuch stood still, his eyes wide with fear. He had never seen the king so angry before. Magnus sat down, his mind racing with thoughts and emotions after reading the anonymous letter. His anger calmed down as he couldn't bring himself to fully believe the contents of the letter. After all, it could have been a trap or a ploy by his enemies to create chaos within the palace. He summoned his trusted attendant, Shadow, and handed him the letter. "I need you to investigate this," the emperor said, his voice low and serious. Shadow nodded, his face a mask of stoicism. "I will do my best, Your Majesty," he replied, bowing respectfully before leaving the room. As he walked through the palace, Shadow pondered the contents of the letter. He decided to begin his investigation by speaking with the palace servants, as they were often privy to information that others were not. After speaking with several servants, Shadow discovered that there had been some unusual activity around Prince Edward's quarters. According to the servants, the prince had been leaving the palace regularly, but nobody knew where he was going. Shadow dug deeper and found some clues in the anonymous letter he had received, confirming the suspicions that something was amiss with the prince's activities. Magnus sat in silence on his throne, lost in deep thought. Shadow, his loyal advisor, stood before him waiting for his command. After a moment, Magnus broke the silence with a tense voice. "How is the investigation progressing regarding the contents of the letter?" Shadow bowed respectfully and responded, "Your Majesty, I have thoroughly investigated the matter and can confirm that there is indeed something amiss with Prince Edward. Magnus' face turned to one of anger and sadness at the news. He pondered for a while, trying to figure out what to do next. Finally, he spoke with a heavy heart. I can hardly believe that my son could be involved in such a heinous act. What do you suggest we do? Shadow hesitated for a moment, considering his response carefully. Your Majesty, I suggest that we thoroughly interrogate the prince, but we must also be cautious and guard ourselves against any possible danger in case he is truly in collusion with the cult. Magnus nodded thoughtfully, realizing that time was pressing and he needed to act quickly. Summon the guards immediately and capture the prince. We must find out everything he knows about the cult, he commanded. Shadow bowed his head in agreement and quickly left the throne room to carry out Magnus' orders. Magnus sat on his throne, lost in thought. He was deeply troubled by the fact that his son is involved in the cult. He had always tried to be a good father and mentor to his children, but it seemed that he had failed with his son. As he waited for the guards to arrive, Magnus couldn't help but think about the events that had led up to this moment. He had always been proud of his son's intelligence and wit, but he had never suspected that he could be involved in something as dangerous as a cult. Mr. Black, the leader priest of the God of Shadow, was sitting in his dark chamber, surrounded by the flickering light of the candles. He had received the news from the spy he planted in the palace that the Emperor had found out about their collusion with the prince. It was only a matter of time before they would be caught. Mr. Black acted fast and quickly made his way to the prince's chambers to inform him of the situation. What is it, Mr. Black? The prince asked, his voice tinged with annoyance. I have seen, my lord, Mr. Black replied, his face grave. The king got wind of our collusion. What? How could that be? The prince asked. Mr. Black said, his voice barely above a whisper. We need to leave immediately or it will be over. Edward was shocked to hear the news. He had been so careful not to be caught, but they still found it out. Mr. Black quickly gave him a plan. We have a safe house where we can lay low for a while until things die down. The prince nodded, quickly gathering a few essentials and donning a cloak to conceal his identity. They made their way through the dark corridors of the palace, trying to be as quiet as possible. They finally reached a secret passageway that led to the outside of the palace. As they stepped out into the night, they heard the sounds of the palace guards searching for them. Mr. Black quickly led the way to a hidden alleyway where a carriage was waiting for them. The driver quickly helped them inside, and they made their way through the city, trying to avoid the guards. After a while, they finally arrived at the safe house, a small cottage on the outskirts of the city. Mr. Black quickly made arrangements for them to stay there until they could come up with a plan. Magnus and his guards burst into Prince Edward's chamber, expecting to find the young prince there. But the room was empty. He looked around, his face a mask of confusion and anger. Where is he? He demanded. The guards scrambled around the room, searching every nook and cranny for any sign of the missing prince. They checked behind curtains, under beds, and even inside the wardrobe. However, Prince Edward was nowhere to be found. Magnus' frustration was palpable. How could he have escaped so quickly? He muttered to himself. One of the guards approached the king cautiously. Your Majesty, he said hesitantly. The rooms appear to have traces of dark magic. Maga's face hardened at the news. Dark magic? He repeated. Are you sure about that? His voice raised. The guard nodded solemnly. Yes, Your Majesty. We found remnants of a spell that was cast recently. Magnus' head was spinning. He couldn't believe that his son had been involved with the cultists who were wreaking havoc in the city. He had wanted to catch him and put a stop to his involvement, but with the prince now on the run, he feared that things would only escalate. We must find him, Magnus declared, his voice firm. He cannot be allowed to continue down this path. Chapter 18 Ambushed. Magnus stood at the head of the long table in the grand hall, surrounded by his trusted advisors and commanders. Before him, a group of knights, ready to receive their orders. My dear knights, he began, his voice grave and resolute. As you are all aware, my son has been implicated in the activities of a dangerous cult that has been causing chaos and destruction throughout the city. He paused, his eyes scanning the faces of the knights before him, seeking their attention and focus. It is imperative that we find him and put an end to this madness before it's too late. The knights nodded solemnly, their expressions firm and determined. I entrust each of you with the responsibility of leading a team to search the area of this city. Your task is to scour every corner, every crevice, and every possible hiding place where my son and the cult could be lurking. Your mission is to leave no stone unturned and no effort spared until they are found. As he spoke, Magnus' eyes moved from one knight to another, his voice gaining strength and conviction. I expect nothing less than your full commitment and loyalty to this task. Remember, this is not just about the safety of my son, but the safety of our entire city. With a final nod, he dismissed the knights, who quickly dispersed to gather their men and begin their search. The hall fell silent as Magnus turned to his advisors, his face etched with concern and worry. As the knights went from house to house searching for Prince Edward and the cult, they were met with various reactions from the citizens of the city. Some people were cooperative and willingly allowed the knights to search their homes, hoping to aid in their search. Others were hostile, angry that their privacy was being invaded and that their homes were being turned upside down in the search. In one particular house, a woman stood at the door with her arms crossed, glaring at the knights. You have no right to barge in here like this, she spat. I have nothing to do with your little prince, so leave me alone. Her voice was laced with anger. The knights tried to explain their situation and assure the woman that they were only doing their duty, but she remained unmoved. At the protest of the women, they searched her house thoroughly but found nothing related to their case. As they left, the woman slammed the door shut behind them, muttering curses under her breath. In another house, an elderly man welcomed the knights with open arms, eager to help in any way he could. The old man offered the knights food and drink, grateful for their efforts to rid the city of the cultists. The knights trudged wearily through the city, their spirits dampened by the fruitless days of searching for the prince. They had scoured every corner of the city, turning over every stone, questioning every citizen, and yet they had found no trace of Prince Edward or the cult that had taken him. As they walked through the streets, they talked among themselves, sharing their frustrations and doubts. Do you think we'll ever find him? Asked one knight. Another knight shook his head. I don't know. But we can't give up. We have a duty to the king and to the people of this city. We have to keep searching. But how? Asked a third knight. We've searched everywhere. We've questioned everyone. The first knight spoke up again. We have to keep our eyes and ears open. Maybe someone will see something or hear something. We have to keep pushing, keep trying. That's all we can do. They trudged on in silence for a few moments, each lost in their own thoughts. The weight of their task was heavy on their shoulders, and the hopelessness of the situation threatened to overwhelm them. But then, one knight jokingly said, You know, my mother used to tell me that sometimes when you're looking for something, you have to stop looking so hard. You have to relax and let it come to you. The other knights looked at him skeptically, but he continued. I'm serious. Maybe we've been searching too hard, too desperately. Maybe we need to take a step back, let's relax a little, and see if anything comes our way. The knights exchanged glances, considering his words. It was a long shot, but at this point, they were willing to try anything. They decided to relax from their search and wander the city, keeping their eyes and ears open for any sign of the prince. As they walked, they tried to let go of their desperation and fears. And then, as if by magic, they heard a whisper from a citizen chatting with someone that he had seen a group of suspicious-looking individuals in a nearby alley. The knights rushed to the scene and found a hint of cult presence, as well as a small piece of cloth with residual dark magic. Upon further inspection, they realized that it belonged to a member of the cult. They looked at each other with surprised expressions. Maybe the knight's mother had been right after all. Sometimes you have to stop looking and let the solution come to you. Excited by this discovery, the knights wasted no time and employed their tracking magic on the piece of cloth with the residual magic. Following the trail of clues, they swiftly made their way to a house located on the outskirts of the city. The house was old and rundown, with peeling paint and a roof that looked like it was about to cave in. With their swords drawn and their shields ready, they cautiously approached the house. The interior of the house was dark and musty, with only a few rays of light shining through the boarded-up windows. They moved slowly, their eyes scanning every inch of the room for any sign of danger. It wasn't long before they found what they were looking for. In a corner of the room, hidden behind a pile of old blankets and debris, they discovered a secret passage. It was small and narrow, but big enough for a person to pass through, and it was clear that it had been used recently. With their hearts pounding in their chests, the knights walked through the passage one by one, their swords held tightly in their hands. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and mildew, and they could hear the sound of rats scurrying around them. After what seemed like hours, they finally emerged into a large underground chamber. Inside the underground chamber, they could see flickering candles, casting eerie shadows across the walls. As they surveyed the room, they were unaware that they were being watched from the shadows by a figure clad in dark robes. This was Mr. Black, the leader of the cult, who had been monitoring the knights' movements from a hidden place. He had intentionally provided clues leading to the abandoned house, hoping to lure the knight and ambush them. The knights, sensing the ominous presence around them, began to ready their weapons and prepare for battle. Little did they know that they were walking straight into a trap and that Mr. Black and his followers were waiting for them with killing intent. The stage was set for a fierce battle between the knights and the cultists, and the outcome would determine the fate of the kingdom. Chapter 19 Fight between Powerhouse. Mr. Black stepped out of the shadows, a wicked smile playing on his lips. His eyes glinted with malevolent energy, and he gestured to his followers to attack. The knights charged forward, swords at the ready, meeting the cultists in a clash of steel and magic. Spells were flung back and forth, and the room was soon filled with smoke and dust. The knights fought with all their might, but they were outnumbered and outmatched by the cultists' dark magic. The cultists used dark magic to conjure up spells that would immobilize the knights. They also used deadly weapons, such as poisoned arrows and knives, to try and take down their opponents. The knights fought back with their swords, shields, and spears. Amidst the chaos, Prince Edward was hiding in a corner, trembling with fear. He was fully aware that the knights were here for him, and he was desperate to escape this place. He had naively thought that affiliating with the cult would bring him no harm. However, he realized that his involvement with the cult had led to such an overwhelming situation. As the battle raged on, the knights began to take casualties. Some were struck down by the cultists' dark magic, while others were wounded by their weapons. The knights were growing tired and weary, and their resolve was beginning to falter. Despite this, they fought on, determined to capture Prince Edward. The fight was intense, with neither side gaining a clear advantage. The outcome was uncertain, and the fate of the city hung in the balance. As the fight continued, the knights began to make progress. They managed to push the cultists back, inching closer and closer to Prince Edward's hiding spot. The cultists were becoming more desperate, knowing that their plans were about to be foiled. The knights finally surrounded Prince Edward's hiding spot, preparing to capture him and bring him to the king. However, the prince was nowhere to be found. He had slipped away in the chaos of the battle, leaving the knights with no choice but to retreat and regroup. Suddenly, a wave of dark energy pulsed through the air, knocking several knights to the ground. The cultists had unleashed their deadliest weapon, a powerful spell that sapped the strength and willpower of its victims. The knights struggled to regain their footing, their movements slow and sluggish. Just as it seemed the knights were about to be defeated, one of them noticed movement out of the corner of their eye. It was Prince Edward, cowering in a corner of the room, his eyes wide with fear. The knights knew that they had to end this once and for all. Filled with renewed vigor, their determination was fueled by the sight of their target. The cultists fought back fiercely, but they were slowly losing ground. The knights had suffered heavy casualties, but they managed to hold their ground and push the cultists back. They were tired, wounded, and grieving for their fallen comrades, but they knew that they had to press on. As the battle raged on, Mr. Black stood on the sidelines watching with a cold expression. He already had set up the sacrificial array in place. The function of the array is to sacrifice the body of the dead knight to the shadow god. Doing this, the god he believed in would grant an immense power. As the pile of bodies grew higher and higher, the cultists continued to fight fiercely, using dark magic and deadly weapons. Mr. Black's eyes glinted with an otherworldly light as he raised his arms and began to chant in a language unknown to mortal ears. The air grew thick with the scent of burning incense, and the sound of eerie whispers filled the room. Black's voice grew louder and more forceful, his hands moving in a complex pattern as he summoned the power of the shadow god. The pile of bodies began to glow with an eerie purple light, and tendrils of dark energy snaked their way out of the corpses and into Mr. Black's body. He gritted his teeth, sweat pouring down his face as he continued to channel the power. Suddenly, with a final burst of energy, Mr. Black released the power, causing the bodies to explode in a shower of purple sparks. The room was filled with the deafening sound of the sacrificial array activating, and Black's body was surrounded by a maelstrom of dark energy. With a maniacal laugh, he reveled in the surge of energy coursing through his veins, his eyes blazing with power and madness. The scout rushed into the throne room, his breathing was ragged and his clothes disheveled. "Your Majesty," he gasped. "We have found the cult's secret lair. It's in the abandoned house at the edge of the kingdom." Magnus' eyes widened in alarm at the news. Without hesitation, he rose from his throne and ordered his guards to prepare for battle. "Take me there at once," he commanded. "We must stop them before it's too late." With that, Magnus led his advisor, Shadow, and the troops out of the castle and toward the edge of the kingdom. As they arrived on the scene, Magnus was met with a devastating sight. Corpses were strewn haphazardly throughout the room, their lifeless forms contorted in gruesome positions. The air reeked of death and blood, assaulting his senses with an overwhelming stench. As he scanned the room, his heart sank at the sight of his son, Prince Edward, standing in the center of the room, his vacant eyes revealing that he had been killed using the power of darkness. As Magnus laid eyes on Mr. Black, he knew that he was the one responsible for the death of his son. Anger and devastation surged through him as he realized the extent of the damage the cult had caused. He looked at his advisor, Shadow, a Tier 4 Sky Knight and also his lifetime friend. Shadow immediately understood what Magnus' eyes were conveying. Shadow could feel the power emanating from the cult leader, Mr. Black, and realized it was closer to that of a Tier 5 Lunar Knight. They would only have a chance of winning if they fought using their lives, just like in the old days. Seeing that Shadow understood his message without words, Magnus let out a sigh. "This is not a battle you can join," he told the remaining guard who was still alive, urging them to retreat. Gathering his blood, Magnus activated his blood-burning technique for a power boost. Observing Magnus burning his blood, Shadow followed suit. "I suppose this will be our final battle, my friend," Shadow murmured to himself with a smile. With a slash, Magnus' sword emitted a red blood mana, and Shadow synchronized his attack to merge with Magnus, amplifying its strength. Witnessing the two fighters combining their efforts, Mr. Black sneered. What could a Tier 4 Sky Knight possibly do? Although not yet a Tier 5 Lunar Knight, Mr. Black believed that with the blessing of his sacrifice to the Shadow God, he could crush a Tier 4 Sky Knight like an ant. However, when the blood-red sword mana reached him, fear contorted his face as he sensed a cursed energy within it. This type of attack consumed lifespan. While knights may not have as long a lifespan as mages in the same tier, they could still live for a considerable time. For example, a Tier 4 Sky Knight could typically live for 1,000 years. But what he didn't know was that Magnus' battle injuries from his youth in the central continent had plagued his body, shortening his life. As for Shadow, although he could live longer than Magnus, his strength was artificial and forcibly pushed to advance. Shadow knew he could no longer advance, and his lifespan was equivalent to that of a Tier 3 Earth Knight, approximately 300 years. Realizing his body couldn't withstand such an attack, Mr. Black parried and was sent flying backward. Magnus and Shadow shared a tacit understanding, wasting no time as they further burned their lifespans, denying Mr. Black any chance. As Mr. Black was pushed back in the air, he witnessed their actions and cursed under his breath, "Ruthless bastards." If he could fully control his strength, he believed he could crush them like tomatoes. Magnus and Shadow swiftly closed in on Mr. Black's position, launching another attack with their combined blood-red mana. Naturally, Mr. Black was not about to let this attack land on him. Twisting his body to the limit, he parried the attack once again. This back and forth of attacking and parrying continued. Magnus and Shadow played Mr. Black as if he were a tennis ball. Despite Mr. Black's advantage in power and mana, his speed and reaction remained the same. After a while of relentless fighting, Magnus and Shadow visibly aged, clearly displaying the toll on their lifespans. As Mr. Black continued to soar through the air like a tennis ball, he smiled, anticipating his impending victory. Magnus and Shadow realized that they couldn't prolong the battle any longer. Initially, they had plans to continue living even if it was just for a short while after this fight. However, understanding that they couldn't exploit their enemies' weaknesses, they silently prepared to end it once and for all. Gathering every ounce of their life energy, they positioned themselves behind Mr. Black, ready to strike. This time, their attack emanated a darker, crimson hue compared to before. At this moment, Mr. Black already sensed his impending death. He could feel that this attack was at least 10 times more potent than the last. Frustration consumed him. Although he didn't understand the technique they were using, he also possessed a forbidden technique that could use his mana and increase his strength. However, the consequence was that his strength would degrade to that of a Tier 3 Earth Knight. But how could he willingly accept that? He was only a step away from becoming a Tier 5 Lunar Knight. "I regret it. I regret it. I regret it," were his last thoughts before the blood-red sword mana sliced him in half. Magnus and Shadow, on the other hand, resembled mummies drained of essence. They collapsed to the ground, savoring their final moments of being alive, as their last attack consumed the entirety of their lifespan. "It was nice meeting you, my friend," Magnus whispered weakly, his gaze fixed upon the starry sky of the now devastated place. "Likewise, I hope we meet again in our next life," Shadow replied, a smile gracing his face as he reminisced about his time with Magnus. After fighting their entire lives in the central continent and realizing they could no longer advance, they decided to retreat to their origin. The most desolate part of the cursed continent, seeking a retired life as kings of their own domain. Initially, Shadow had established his own kingdom for retirement. However, upon discovering he couldn't father an heir, he relinquished the idea and merged his created kingdom with Maximus, allowing them to live out their retired lives together. Though their journey had been arduous and filled with suffering, Shadow could proudly declare that he had lived a fulfilling life. Chapter 20: The Scattered Empire. The news of the king's death spread like wildfire throughout the kingdom. Shock, anger, and grief gripped the people who had lost their beloved ruler. The Council of Ministers convened an emergency meeting to discuss the situation and plan a course of action. The council's top priority was to track down the remaining cult responsible for the king's murder. They offered a significant reward for anyone who could find information regarding the cults. The remaining knights, who had been loyal to the late king, were also given the responsibility of tracking down the cult members. The hunt for the cult members became the top priority of the kingdom. The knights scoured every inch of the kingdom, searching for clues and interrogating suspects. The kingdom was now in a state of high alert, and the council took every measure to ensure the safety of the citizens. A curfew was imposed, and anyone found loitering on the streets after dark was taken into custody for questioning. The borders were sealed, and checkpoints were established to screen all incoming and outgoing traffic. Amid all this chaos, the crown prince stepped forward and declared himself the new ruler of the kingdom. He vowed to bring justice and restore peace and order to the kingdom. However, his ascension was not met with the unanimous support of the nobles and some ministers. They believed that he was too young and inexperienced to rule the kingdom and that his reign would be marked by instability and uncertainty. The opposition to the crown prince's succession was led by a group of powerful nobles who held significant influence to sway the court decisions. They argued that the kingdom needed a ruler with more experience and a proven track record of leadership. The ministers also voiced their concerns, citing the crown prince's lack of understanding of the complexities of governance and his lack of vision for the future of the kingdom. The crown prince's supporters argued that his youth and enthusiasm would bring fresh ideas and perspectives to the kingdom. On the other hand, his opposition pointed out his lack of experience and warned of the potential for chaos and instability. As the days passed, it became clear that the opposition to the crown prince's succession was too strong to overcome. The crown prince's frustration grew as he saw his dreams of ruling the empire slip away. In the end, the crown prince's efforts were in vain. The nobles and ministers remained opposed to his succession, and the court remained divided. The failed succession of the crown prince left the kingdom in a state of disarray, with no clear direction or leadership. The noble houses that had once pledged their allegiance to the new ruler now began to fight amongst themselves for power and control. Each noble house sought to seize as much power as they could take advantage of. As the noble houses fought amongst themselves, the common people suffered. They were caught in the crossfire of these power struggles, with their homes and livelihoods destroyed by the warring nobles. The once great cities of the empire were reduced to rubble, and the countryside was plagued by bandits and marauders. The ministers, who were supposed to govern the kingdom in the absence of a ruler, were too busy bickering and fighting amongst themselves to take any decisive action. The noble families, sensing an opportunity to increase their power and wealth, began vying for control. Among them were 3 powerful dukes who had been secretly planning to divide the kingdom amongst themselves for years. Around a large round table surrounded by maps and scrolls, the first duke, Charles, spoke, "Gentlemen, the time has come for us to take action." Darwin nodded in agreement. "We have been planning for this moment for years. The other noble families are weak, and they will not be able to withstand our power together." Thomas leaned forward. "The other nobles will not take kindly to us dividing the empire amongst ourselves. We must make sure to plan this carefully." The 3 dukes continued to discuss their plan, debating the logistics and details of how they would divide the empire. As they talked, their excitement grew, and they could see the potential for power and wealth that lay ahead. After much discussion, the 3 dukes divided the empire along geographical lines. Charles was in charge of ruling the northern regions. Darwin will take control of the eastern regions. And Thomas will be ruling over the southern regions. They began to gather their armies, secretly recruiting soldiers and mercenaries from across the kingdom. They also began to work on building alliances with other noble families, offering them land and titles. The noble houses of the empire were in a state of turmoil as the 3 dukes began to divide the empire among themselves. The remaining noble houses that hadn't joined their faction were left with only a fraction of the land and resources they once had. The only chance they had was to ally, but it wasn't an easy one. Many of the noble houses had long-standing feuds and grudges against one another, and trust was in short supply. Lord Harrington, a charismatic noble, sent invitations to all the nobles who had their territory plundered. The meeting place was held in a neutral land away from the chaos. As the noble houses arrived at the location, a large hall in the center of the city. The atmosphere was tense and their faces stern and serious. Lord Harrington, the leader of the alliance, stood up from his seat and faced them. "My fellow nobles," he began, his voice echoing through the hall. "We are here today because we face a common enemy. The dukes have grown too powerful and we cannot defeat them alone. We must band together if we want to take back the land that is rightfully ours." After his speech, there was a tense silence in the hall as the noble houses exchanged wary glances. Finally, Lord Huxley stood up. "I agree with Lord Harrington. We cannot fight the dukes alone and need each other's support," he said. Slowly, one by one, the other noble houses spoke in favor of Lord Harrington. They also acknowledged that the dukes were too powerful and needed each other's help if they want to succeed. Over the next few weeks, the alliance grew in strength. Noble Council began to make plans for how they would fight back against the dukes. They also began to gather resources, train soldiers, and develop strategies. The dukes were not idle during this time. They knew that the noble houses were gathering their strength and began to take measures to prevent an uprising. They increased their military presence in the occupied territories and began to build fortifications. After they had spent months planning and gathering their strength, the alliance first focused its efforts on attacking Duke Darwin. Despite the Duke having more soldiers and better trained troops. However, due to the massive tract of land the Duke ruled, the alliance was able to use guerrilla warfare tactics and mobilize a large number of ragtag groups to their advantage. In the aftermath of the battle, the Dukes were forced to relinquish a large tract of land and severely shrunk their defense. The noble houses were overjoyed with their first victory, but the aftermath was chaotic. The process of dividing the land among the noble houses led to disputes and disagreements. Nevertheless, they were overjoyed by their first victory.